A norm that creates conflicts is a perversion instead of is what the rule is supposed to do, namely to help us avoid conflicts. Only private or exclusive property makes it possible that all otherwise unavoidable conflicts can be avoided. A norm that would generate conflict, that creates conflicts, is contrary to the very purpose of the norm or a rule. The state is not only an institution that produces inferior goods, bad goods, low quality goods, but it actually produces bads. That is to say, goods that are not really goods at all, what we call bads. The state is an agency that exercises a territorial monopoly of ultimate decision making. If you can decide who is right and wrong in every case, even in cases involving yourself, then you will provoke and cause conflicts. And then, of course, decide these conflicts in your own favor. States will substitute legislation for law. They make the law. They make laws and say, it is all right if I hit you on the head sometimes. The norm that creates conflicts is a perversion. If you can decide who is right and wrong in every case, even in cases involving yourself, then you will provoke and cause conflicts. Institution of private property is definitely not just a convention, because no alternative to it exists. Only private or exclusive property makes it possible that all otherwise unavoidable conflicts can be avoided. And only the principle of property acquisition by acts of original appropriation, that is, of appropriating something that was previously unowned, makes it possible that conflicts can be avoided from the beginning of mankind on, so to speak, until its very end. Because the first appropriator of something did not involve anyone in any conflict. He was the first one. Nobody else was there. So the first appropriation of something as private property is a conflict-free way of transferring something was previously some external thing into something that is private property.
Hey, it's Jose Galison. You're watching No Way Jose. You can find me on No Way Jose YouTube channel, all the major auto podcatchers, and Odyssey as well. Today, my guest is Toad. We're continuing our live reading series of Democracy of the God That Failed by Hermann Hoppe. Do want to remind you guys, those intros, those are from Romero Synth. Go check him out. He's got a lot of other synth stuff. Got a lot of other Hoppe stuff. He's got a couple other little things you guys might like. So go check out his stuff for sure. Yeah, I know there's a little long, but keep in mind you have a fast forward button, so I don't want to hear you complaining. Yes, like I said, we're doing the live reading today. Do remind you all how this works. These, like this is one of the ones we will be paying Wallen, but how this works is we record them and we put out a live stream for our for my patrons, and and roughly about a week or so later we put it up public for everybody. So if you want to be able to get the episodes early or be able to catch those live streams, either or, you got to go to patreon.com. Just know who 2020. Lowest levels $2, highest levels 20. 20 are my sponsors. And my sponsors are Mikkel Thorpe of the Expat Money Show. I also have Jeremy, who has a Etsy store, etsy.com/shop/raising liberty. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeremy Rhymes. Then my co-host Toad, he'll give his plugs here in a little bit. because he is joining me today for the live reading. I also have Zach Overacker at ZOVERACK. Then Mike Dagalash, and then Lindsay, who is a newer patron. She recently lost her TikTok, but got a new one, or maybe it was an old one. I don't know. She had a backup. Her TikTok got nuked. I don't know what for. She's trying to get back, but it's Lindsay OKC. She covers a lot of the OKC bombing type stuff, but on TikTok. So if you want to support, OKC on TikTok, if you're a TikTok type person, go check her out. Make sure you go to toplobsta.com, use Jose at checkout, get 10% off. That's where you can get the Yiki shirt. You can get a bunch of other stuff. You can get Tower Gang stuff. I do also want to remind you guys, I just had my one of my, I guess, kind of my first sort of essay I ever really wrote that got published in a magazine recently in Garrison. My Kenneth Trying to Do piece, Kenneth Trying to Do Didn't Kill Himself, is the name of that article. That is in Garrison, the Journal of History and Politics, or Deep History and Politics, or History and Deep Politics. I forget the specific, but it's that's what it is. Definitely go check it out. That will be in the. I'll probably put that in the video description. So if you want to buy that magazine, get a bunch of other stuff. Richard Booth has a piece in that one too. A lot of good stuff in that. Highly recommend it. And with that, let's go ahead and get Toad in here and get into it. Hey, what's up, bud? How you doing?
What's up? I feel like I just saw you.
Yeah, right. It's almost like we do this thing every Wednesday or something. I guess I didn't do your little plug because you are a sponsor. I guess you want to give them your plugs real quick, and then since we did just kind of allude to that other show we do.
Oh yeah, never heard of it. Tower Gang Toad on Twitter, and Jose and I do the Tower Gang podcast, which is the most offensive comedy podcast, the most offensive podcast in general on the planet. Every Wednesday night, 9-11 p.m. Tower Gang Pod everywhere. That's me, Jose, Cole, aka formerly Fat Dave, Clint from Liberty Lockdown, TopLobsta, and probably never read Coverdale again. Did he quit? I don't know.
Nah, he'll show up eventually every once in a great while.
Read Coverdale very infrequently.
Yeah. But
yeah, it's a fun show, hilarious show, and we're on Locals now because our Patreon got nuked. So it's towergang.locals.com, and towergangpod.com is the link tree. So all the links are there. It's mostly Tower Gang Pod everywhere.
And we got Instabanned when we tried to make an Instagram account for it, didn't we?
Yeah,
which still blows my mind.
On Instagram. Yeah,
the only thing I can think of is was it you that made it?
Yeah.
Did you already have an Instagram account?
I technically have one through Facebook, yeah, but that's my personal. I use my personal email for that. For the Tower Gang one, I used the Tower Gang email. I did not use a phone number at all, so there was no link to me. And I was doing it on a 5G connection, so they couldn't. I guess they could do it through my device, but device recognition. But other than that, it was either the Tower Gang name or the Tower Gang email, I think, because the email is associated. But
even then, I don't think there's anything on Instagram that says you can have more than one account. So unless you're banner evading maybe or something like that. I'm not so familiar with Instagram. It's weird. Maybe they use an AI or something. That was the first thing that came in my mind, that they have some sort of AI and they recognize it's an offensive show and they're like, nope.
That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. But all right. Anyways, enough of that. Let's go ahead and let's start getting this live reading. We are in the middle of a chapter right now, and I think it would behoove our audience if you gave us a little recap, kind of what we covered last episode, and we're going to cover the second half of this this chapter here. This one's a little bit shorter, so just get a quick recap, and then we'll go ahead and just get right into the live reading. If you're someone who's knocking these all out at once, here's your opportunity to fast forward 30 seconds to a minute. So there you go.
Unless you want the recap, but we only did ours a week ago, and I still was wait a minute, I need to refresh my memory on what we were talking about last time. So I think that this is the second of 2 immigration chapters in a row in general, and it was such a long time ago that we did the previous one. I don't remember exactly.
I'm so fucking over immigration.
Exactly what was talking about in that one, but. Well, apparently Liberty Twitter is not, and I still fight that fight just because I think the people that are on the open border side are just losers. So I try to bully them and kind of fail, I guess. But the last episode, when we did the first half of this chapter is on free trade and restricted immigration, I believe is the name of the chapter. So the first part of the chapter, which we did last week, he opened it by talking about how people conflate free trade with open immigration and think that those two things are kind of necessary together and they're consistent together. He explained why that is not the case. Like, one is not required to have the other, and in fact, they kind of have nothing to do with each other, and immigration is completely different from trade. So he explained that, which I don't think we need to go into the details on that. You can go watch that last episode. He explained that from a property rights perspective, and then he started getting into his he was going to be laying out 3 different arguments against open immigration, where the first argument was against open immigration, which that was the first part of sort of the end of the section that we did last time. Then he went into arguing against open immigration with conditions even added to it, such as removing the welfare state. He was still arguing against open immigration even with no welfare state anymore. So we did those last week. And then the third one, which is going to be what we talk about tonight, is he's arguing for some sort of immigration restrictions.
All right. You ready to do this, bud?
Let's do it.
All right. We're on part 5 of chapter. What even chapter is this?
8. I think it's
8 on free trade and restricted immigration.
Yeah, and it's page 162 in my book.
Yes, same here. From the recognition that proponents of free trade and markets cannot advocate free immigration without being inconsistent and contradicting themselves, and that therefore immigration must logically be restricted, it is but a small step to the further recognition of how it must be restricted. In fact, all high-wage area governments presently restrict immigration in one way or another. Nowhere is immigration free, unconditionally or conditionally. And for context, you put free in quotations because it means, it depends on how you. Anyways, however, the restriction imposed on immigration by the United States and by Switzerland, for instance, are quite different. Which restrictions should exist? More precisely, which immigration restrictions is a free trader and free marketeer logically compelled to uphold and promote? I'll just keep going. Not really much to comment on that one. He's just kind of laying out the points. Not the points, but kind of what the question is. The guiding principle of a high wage area's country's immigration policy falls from the insight that to be free in the same sense as trade is free, immigration must be invited. The details follow from the further elucidation and exemplification of the concepts of invitation versus invasion and forced integration. All right, we're getting into the invitation stuff. If you're a baby libertarian, this may be new to you, but if you've been around the block for a minute, you understand where we're going with this. This is like, I think, a Walter Block thing as well. There's a few libertarians that promote like a invitation type style immigration system would be the best way to go about it. Kind of like yes.
Yeah, Hoppe kind of promotes like a sponsorship type of thing where he would recommend that somebody who already is a citizen of that country be assume responsibility for that person who's coming in is sort of the idea. And he's kind of getting at what I sort of just alluded to, talking about what we were talking about last week, where he kind of made that property rights argument where he's saying that in the case of free trade, it's like always invited in a way because you have both parties agreeing to make that trade. One person is agreeing to sell that thing to the other person. They're agreeing to exchange that good. Whereas in the case of immigration, it is quite possible that nobody is agreeing to have that person come in.
Yes. To this end, it is necessary to presuppose as a conceptual benchmark the existence of what political philosophers have described as a private property anarchy, anarcho-capitalism, or ordered anarchy. All land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, and harbors. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted. That is, the owner is permitted to do whatever he pleases with his property as long as he does not physically damage the property of others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less restricted. As is currently the case in some housing developments, the owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property, restrictive covenants, voluntary zoning, for example, which might include residential rather than commercial use. No buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to unmarried couples, smokers, or Germans, for instance. I think he threw in that last one to kind of illustrate that, like, hey, it can be as arbitrary as you want. It just may not be the greatest idea depending on where you're at, you know?
Right. They might not allow me in.
Yes. Yep.
Is
Are you
kind of what
German?
he's saying there. No, Hoppe.
Oh, yeah.
Or is he
yeah.
Austrian?
He's not a
Is he
big fan of the
Austrian or
gays.
German? I forget. Yeah. He's trying to balance it out. Like, I say homosexuals sometimes, but I say the Germans in other cases.
Oh, no, I was joking. I was just teasing you saying you're gay.
Oh, I'm gay. Oh, all right. Well, that's obvious.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with being gay. But anyways, this is he's just kind of laying it out right here.
Yeah, I mean, he's just saying, that he is an ANCAP, and he is saying the ideal is still privatization of everything. And I'm assuming that, like he does throughout this book, what he's going to argue for is some sort of like within the paradigm of we do have a state controlling the borders here, like what is going to sort of approach what that private
the closest approximation.
What is going to closely approximate what the private society would.
So I mean, obviously this is something that I think I read like half of like Human Action forever ago. Wait, is Human Action Mises, or is that
it
what
is
was the other one? What didn't Rothbard do his own version of it? I forget.
Rothbard did Man, Economy, and State.
Actually, I think I didn't do Human Action, and I did like half of Man, Economy, and State. I just never finished it. But that was a common thing he would do to compare, like, say, economically speaking. He would compare, like, he would have this, like, I forget what he called it, but he would be like, all things constant, like this economic system, and he would like use that to compare to. Because the problem is whenever you're dealing with like economics, same thing. I guess when you're talking about these political philosophies, ideas here. There's so many different factors, so he would have had this like constant that was kind of like, the free, like what would be in a true free market, and then use that to compare against. And that's kind of what Hoppe is doing here with the whole immigration thing. It's the idea is like, okay, well, let's first establish what likely would be the case in a private property type anarchy, and then obviously we're not in private property anarchy, so like, and there is no right answer. So what is the closest thing? Like, that's kind of what we're doing here. All right. Anyways.
Yeah.
Clearly, in this kind of society, there is no such thing as freedom of immigration or an immigrant's right of way. Rather, there exists the freedom of many independent private property owners to admit or exclude others from their own property in accordance with their own restricted or unrestricted property titles. Admission to some territories might be easy, while to others it might be nearly impossible. Moreover, admission to the property or of one party does not imply the freedom to move around, unless other property owners have agreed to such movements. There will be as much immigration or non-immigration, inclusivity or exclusivity, desegregation or segregation, non-discrimination or discrimination as individual owners or associations of individual owners desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the first paragraph that you read tonight, he was talking about how in the current situation, the current state of affairs, no country actually has completely open immigration. And he wasn't really commenting on whether or not, I'm assuming he would not say that that's actually a good thing. But he was just saying that is the case, that there are restrictions everywhere. But then you can question, like, well, what type of restrictions are they? And they can be completely different in each country, whatever. Some of them are going to be much better than others in his view. And then what he's talking about here, he's saying that in a completely privatized society, there would be really no such thing as freedom of movement, because all of the land, who the owner is in some way. And it's not like a disputed it's not disputed land or disputed claim over that land, like you might say would be the case with the government controlled land, the public land.
And I do want to clarify. I do think that in this situation he's laying out, like, a lot of people that breaks their mind, like, how would you even move around in this world? It's like, okay, there still would be something that is a close approximation to public roads or public land or whatever that we have now. Because, like, let's say, for example, you're a Walmart. And obviously you want to do business. So you're likely to probably either make the roads yourself, or to contract them out, or to work with other businesses to make the funds for roads or whatever. And like, even then they might still have their own rules for said roads or whatever, or different things. But it would probably be something close to basically a free movement because they want people there. They might have some loose rules here and there that, that may be loosely enforced or whatever. But the idea that, because I think it just breaks people's mind trying to understand this concept. Like, how are we supposed to exist if everything's owned? It's like, okay, but it'd be kind of almost in a lot of ways not very different because
right.
I mean, if you think about the the only thing that would really throw off people is public property. But even then, it would probably still kind of be roughly the same-ish to some extent, but just better probably.
Yeah. I mean, he's saying that, like, it would be a concept where everybody is actually invited in this type of situation, but that, like you said, with a store, the store is going to want to invite most people to come there because they want to be able to sell their goods. But of course, you'd want to kind of have more of like a high trust society developed at that point, because of course, like, I think if I mean, given the current situation, like cities and stuff, if you have a store and that store is probably not going to want everybody to come in right now, given like how high the rate of like crime is right now and the robberies and stuff. So there is kind of a lot to consider.
I think there'd be a varying levels of trust, if that makes sense. So like I used Walmart as an example. I think whatever routes or Walmart itself or whatever is going to be probably way less exclusive, whether it be their roads that lead to it or the building itself or whatever. But now if you get to like, I don't know, I guess Abercrombie and Fitch doesn't work as well anymore because it's not the friggin' early 2000s. But I don't know, some sort of more exclusive-ish, nicer place. I mean, it's still probably going to be somewhat open because if it's a place of business, they're going to want people there, but it's going to be probably a little bit more restrictive in whatever ways they see fit. So
maybe there'd be like subscription-based roads in some cases, and like, who knows?
But even then, this clears up a lot of these issues that we talk about. We're talking about the homeless or this person or what do we do with that building or that building? Like it will make it so it's more closely, everything will be closer to what is really appropriate. Like, because we've joked about, I think the last episode about like homeless people taking dumps in libraries. Like in the system that we're talking about here, theoretically you could do that, but let's be real, most aren't going to do that. But like, I mean, not saying that happens now, but there are probably rules in public entities now that I guess they do. It's like, I'm sure if it's a homeless person, you probably could go to a lot of public places or just a mentally ill person or whoever. Whereas in a public-private society, a private property society, that's not going to be the case as much because they'll be like, no, get out. There's no reason they can't say get out because it's their property. And that's more appropriate. Whereas somewhere like a Walmart or something is probably going to be far more inviting to people of a lower caste.
Like I got off one train that I take yesterday, got into the station. I need to get up and then try to get onto another train. And like, I didn't want to go around and take the stairs up necessarily. And the elevator was open right there. And I'm like, I'm going to run right into the elevator because there's somebody in there. It's open. Going to get up to the second floor fast or whatever. I get in there and it's just like this huge, like, puddle of piss in there because some like homeless person must have got in there and pissed all over the elevator. So it does happen in cities like this. Welcome to Boston.
All right. On to you, Toad.
Where are we at here? Next page, 164. All right. The reason for citing the model of an anarcho-capitalist society is that no such thing as forced integration, uninvited migration is possible, permitted within its framework. Under this scenario, no difference between the physical movement of goods and the migration of people exists. Just as every product movement reflects an underlying agreement between sender and receiver, so are all movements of immigrants into and within an anarcho-capitalist society the result of an agreement between the immigrant and one or a series of receiving domestic property owners. Hence, even if the anarcho-capitalist model is ultimately rejected, and if for realism's sake, the existence of a government and of public, in addition to private, goods and property is assumed, it brings into clear focus what a government's immigration policy would have to be if and insofar as this government that derived its legitimacy from the sovereignty of the people and was viewed as the outgrowth of an agreement or social contract, as is presumably the case with all modern post-monarchical governments, of course. Surely such such a popular government, popular in quotes, because I think he means like democratic, basically, which assumed as its primary task the protection of its citizens and their property, the production of domestic security, would want to preserve rather than abolish this no forced integration feature of anarcho-capitalism. That was kind of meaty there. Your mic you're muted. Yeah.
Oopsies. I was saying I really like
Yeah.
how that second half of that paragraph, how it plays out. It does a good job, but I feel like it was taking a stab at democracy,
Yeah.
or just governments in general, because it's like the point is like, hey, this is how this would likely work in a true free society, and all right, you say you derive your abilities from the consent of the governed or whatever. Like, okay, well, this is likely what the government would probably want. So what are we doing here? Like, that's kind of the idea. I like the way he put it. That was well put.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm no fan of democracy, and neither is he. Although I think I would say that, like the arguments from some of these open border types that the majority of people want, like essentially open immigration, that is certainly not true. Like, I think it is the case that I think if you look at like most polls or whatever, that I think it's probably like 70 or 80% are against like completely open immigration, which even that seems kind of too low to me. But yeah, so I don't think that argument really makes much sense. But yeah, I mean, another thing I was going to say here is he's just reiterating again, like the same thing he was talking about before, where when you have free trade, it's obviously an agreement between two people to exchange that good. When you have immigration, it's almost like it's kind of a third party who's like coming in here, because it's like, well, what if nobody agreed to, this person coming in here? And that's why he's kind of like alluding to that sponsorship thing again, where he's saying that, well, if this person wants to come in, you're going to have somebody who is already in that country actually agreeing to it. And then that's like the invitation. And then that's more of, that is in line with like private property principles.
Yeah, no, I particularly like how he frames it here. The idea being that, how do I say this? It's essentially saying that if you buy into the concept of government, this is what you should do. So I don't even know if I don't even know if I would take, at least at this point, by this paragraph alone, that he would necessarily say he's calling for the government to do this. But he's more like saying, if anything, he's like making an appeal to people who buy into the concept of government. And if you're going to have a government, and if you want to properly do it the way you think it's supposedly supposed to be done, this is what you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And so like you can take that as a call to do that if you take the government path, but I don't even necessarily think at this point. He may clarify later and take a different, make a different point about that and actually make that case. But so far, he's not actually saying you necessarily have to do this. He's just saying if there is a proper government and that's what you want to go, if you want to go the government route, like, this is what you probably should be doing. So, and if you want to complain and be like, oh my God, that's not properly libertarian. It's like, okay, well, then don't operate within the government. I mean, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I don't know what you,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Just like, again, like he does throughout this book, like he said in like the paragraph before that or whatever, like, I am an anarcho-capitalist. Like, this is the ideal, privatize everything, the entirely private property situation. However, that is not what we have here. We have a government. So what, given that is the case, then how do we, like, as you said, like more closely approximate what would happen in the private scenario? And that wouldn't be open immigration, which he refers to multiple times as forced integration, which is true. I mean, that is the way to look at it. It is the government just saying all of these people are coming in, essentially, even though that was not necessarily agreed to. Yeah. So he's saying that for those reasons, it would make sense that some sort of restrictions would need to be in place to approximate what would happen in the private scenario.
All right, let's keep moving.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to have to really milk this because we were not in many pages in this one, but then I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is actually kind of meaty stuff.
Yeah, we always do. Yeah, we always do pretty well. This next couple of pages are pretty meaty, actually. Yeah. So, and then that'll be the end of the chapter. But yeah, in order to clarify what this implies, it is necessary to explain how an anarcho-capitalist society is altered by the introduction of a government and how this affects the immigration problem. Since there is no government in an anarcho-capitalist society, there is no clear-cut distinction between inlanders, domestic citizens, and foreigners. This distinction appears only with the establishment of a government. The territory over which a government's power extends then becomes inland, and everyone residing outside of this territory becomes a foreigner. State borders and passports, as distinct from private property borders and titles to property, come into existence, and immigration takes on a new meaning. Immigration becomes immigration by foreigners across state borders, and the decision as to whether or not a person should be admitted no longer rests exclusively with private property owners or associations of such owners, but ultimately with the government qua domestic security producer monopolist. Now, if the government excludes a person while a domestic resident exists who wants to admit this very person onto his property, the result is forced exclusion. And if the government admits a person while no domestic resident exists who wants to have this person on his property, the result is forced integration. So, yeah, I mean, again, like, yeah, some fairly meaty paragraphs here. And he is saying, one, that like the sheer concept of immigration, or what we think of as immigration today, is a government creation. Basically, it's a government thing because it's people passing from state to state, as there was, a territory controlled by one state into a territory controlled by another state. So he's making the point that, well, it is the state that is in control of that migration. It is not private landowners who are in control of that. So essentially, no matter what you do, there's like, that's not a purely libertarian solution, of course. Yeah. And then he makes like the very, he simplifies the argument, which is, this is like why, neither of these solutions is libertarian. He's saying, well, if you have somebody who wants this person to come onto their property, they have invited that person onto their property, if the government blocks that from happening, they are forcefully excluding that person from doing that. However, on the flip side, it is also true that if no person wants this person to come in or wants this person on their property, then that is forced integration.
Yep. I mean, just restating stuff he said earlier, but in a different way. He said this a few different times, but I do like how he really makes a point to say, like, when the government comes in, that's when it creates these hard lines that really throw things off, as opposed to just property owners. But yeah, right. I don't really have anything else to add to that one. Like I said, he's just restating stuff he said earlier. But let's keep it going.
Right. But then somebody, I guess, might argue, like if one person does want to invite, or I guess if it's just one person who, or well, I don't even know what I was going to say. I guess if one person wants to invite this person in, but then he just kind of doesn't mention, like what happens with all the public property, like in that case. So you do have to take that into account as well, which he does like throughout this chapter. But like that simplification of it, he doesn't really bring that up there.
Yeah, you were making the point that we've made earlier, and I think it also made in this book, the idea that this is why democracy kind of sucks, and especially in relation to like something like immigration, because it's the idea of, if, say, they let a bunch of Mexicans into your town or something, the government says, oh, you can come in, or they say you can't come in, one or the other, and there's even one person within that area that's like, well, I kind of want them to come in. It's like, well, theoretically now it's like you're in a spot where it's not libertarian. Like if you could somehow, or it's not proper through a private property rights system, but now theoretically, if it's unanimous, then it's completely within the realms of libertarian in a sense, like private property rights in that sense, because no one's rights are really being infringed upon, because everyone's like, this is, like, we paid money, and I mean, people are being infringed upon through taxes and whatever, but in this specific context of this specific example, if it's unanimous, no, it's not, because that's kind of that is genuinely the will of the people. But when do you ever really have a unanimous type thing like that, especially the larger of a group you get to? But go on.
Right. And you're dealing with sort of like all the people that like live there already, or the people that do have like the best claim to all of this like public land, and like what should be done with it, essentially. All right. Moreover, hand in hand with the institution of a government comes the institution of public property and goods. So he's going to talk about it now, I guess. That is, of property and goods owned collectively by all domestic residents and controlled and administered by the government. The larger or smaller the amount of public government ownership, the greater or smaller will be the potential problem of forced integration. Consider a socialist society like the former Soviet Union or East Germany, for example. All factors of production, capital goods, including all land and natural resources, are publicly owned. Accordingly, if the government admits an uninvited immigrant, it admits him to any place within the country. For without private land ownership, there are no limitations on his internal migrations other than those decreed by government. Under socialism, therefore, forced integration can be spread everywhere and thereby immensely intensified. In fact, in the Soviet Union and East Germany, for instance, the government could quarter a stranger in someone else's private house or apartment. And they don't mean quarter like draw on quarter. They mean quarter as in they can force them to have to live with them, like the Quartering Act, the Third Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This measure and the resulting high-powered forced integration was justified on grounds of the fact that all private houses rested on public land.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that one. I don't know if you do.
I mean,
we could, but I feel like it's kind of repetitive. But go on.
I don't know. I think that was kind of a different way of looking at it. That paragraph, like he's kind of saying, you have to consider like what is like the government controlled land, like how much of it is there basically, and how much of it there is makes the immigration problem stronger, like worse.
Yeah,
like in these socialist or even like communist societies, all of the land is public land basically. So it's sort of, it's everybody's, but it's not, not really. But then, that means that when they're allowing these immigrants to come in, that they're basically allowing those immigrants access to the entire country.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And then if you have like the situation in the US, well, you do have like a pretty substantial amount of public land. So what you still are saying is that those immigrants are now allowed, throughout all of that public land. And, maybe there are people who have more claim to that land, like the people that are paying more taxes into it who don't want that to be the case. So, I think it's a fairly strong way of looking at that argument.
Yeah, you're right.
I would say, yeah. So it has to do with the amount of property. Whereas, of course, if you have, a completely privatized society, the problem doesn't exist at all.
Yeah.
And if you have a society where it's just a really small amount of public land, well, then those immigrants are only allowed, in those particular areas because everybody else can exclude them if they want to. So yeah, I didn't remember that paragraph.
Actually, yeah, you know what? The more you actually, as you say, I'm like, actually, it is a little bit kind of semi-profound and a little bit of a new thing that we haven't tread on so far. Talked on so far. Yeah. Tread on. I don't know why I said tread on. That word came to mind.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and it kind of brought to my mind the fact that like I argue that people that are pro open immigration are actually they delve into arguing for communism essentially because they eventually like their argument logically leads to them arguing for everybody having equal access to the government land, the public land. And that is the definition of communism.
Yeah. And this logically, the point he's making is that obviously by that logic, the smaller the amount of area that's being controlled in an illibertarian, like a non-libertarian way, the more libertarian it is, if that makes sense. The more decentralized it is, if that makes sense. So as if you have, say we have just operating under the federal government, it's just one United States. That is a worse situation, and you have one set of immigration laws. Now, if you break it up by 50 states and they all have their own separate immigration laws, that is better because now when you do something to where, because we mentioned the whole idea that we talked about in the last paragraph with theoretically, unless it's somehow magically unanimous, someone is always, their rights, their property rights are always being tread upon, unless it's somehow magically unanimous. Now, like he brought up with the size of thing. Now, if you have the United States and someone's, and we got to keep in mind, people are always being, their rights are being run roughshod on unless it's unanimous. you're far less likely. You're going to have, how do I say this? You're less likely for it to be unanimous, and it's also going to be less unanimous the larger it is, if that makes sense. So
Yeah. No, I get
essentially,
what you're
private
saying.
property rights are being impinged upon far more in a larger area than in a smaller area. And
Yeah.
so this is where kind of decentralization comes into play.
Yeah, because you have more people who are going to disagree with it. So
Yeah. And logically speaking, if you continue the centralization, you eventually get down to the individual, and then it's, oh, now we're just right where we want to be anyway. So,
Right.
But go on.
Yes. Socialist countries are not high wage areas, of course, or if they are, they will not remain so for long. Their problem is not immigration, but emigration pressure. The Soviet Union and East Germany prohibited emigration and killed people for trying to leave the country. So, as we know, that was the case with like the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was to keep people in the East and not allow them to flee to the much freer West. However, the problem of the extension and intensification of forced integration persists outside of socialism. To be sure, in non-socialist countries such as the United States, Switzerland, and the Federal Republic of Germany, which are favorite immigration destinations, a government-admitted immigrant could not move just anywhere. His freedom of movement would be severely restricted by the extent of private property and private land ownership in particular. Yet, by proceeding on public roads or with public means of transportation and by staying on public land and in public parks and buildings, an immigrant can cross every domestic resident's path and move into virtually any neighborhood. The smaller the quantity of public property, the less likely this will occur. But as long as any public property exists, it cannot be entirely avoided.
He's kind of made the point that I was just making a second ago there. Like, I was
Right.
kind of, yeah. So,
yeah, he's saying that again. And it kind of just brings to mind, like if you think about like me being in a city, like you think about the like completely obvious difference between what goes on like in public areas and public transportation versus like private areas. Like the public transportation is just, I mean, it's run down. You can say, well, yeah, because the government controls it. It's not private. So it's, it's just run poorly. But it also has to do with like the people that are allowed into those areas and stuff. Like it's it's much more high crime. A lot more of that shit goes on there. It's much less safe.
yep.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't have an army of Neelys. So,
well, and they take away your guns. So especially in Massachusetts, some of the worst gun laws in the country. So
I gotta choke them out.
Yeah.
All right. Part 6. A popular government that wants to safeguard citizens and their domestic property from forced integration and foreign invaders has 2 methods of doing so: a corrective and a preventative one. The corrective method is designed to ameliorate the effects of forced immigration once the event has taken place and the invaders are here. As indicated, to achieve this goal, the government must reduce the quantity of public property and expand that of private property as much as possible. And whatever the ratio of private to public property may be, the government should help rather than hinder the enforcement of a private property owner's right to admit and exclude others from his property. If virtually all property is owned privately and the government assists in enforcing private ownership rights, the uninvited immigrants, even if they successfully cross the border and enter the country, would not likely get much further. I like that. I like that a lot. What thoughts, Toad?
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of just comparing and contrasting preventative versus protective measures that the government could take. So I think he's saying that the preventative would be like just not letting them into the country to begin with, versus the protective, which is like, oh, well, they're going to let them in, but then that means they have to provide that protection, at least,
or reduce the amount of public property. Like you could have a very
claim to do.
Yeah, you could have a very free immigration system, but you could just have a very little amounts of public property. So it's like, okay, cool, you can come here, but like, here's these roads you can go along. Here's some of these businesses, public parks. Otherwise, fuck off.
I don't know if I'm right here, but I would assume that the argument that he would be making here is that the preventative measures make more sense than the protective, because you're stopping it, at the outset, which I think would be easier easier and in advance. Whereas, if you let them in, you're it's more of like this is like your like last last resort type of thing. And like, it's, like you might like let things slip. Like there's a greater chance that bad things are going to happen. And yeah, I mean, of course it's the government, so they're not even going to do it, but yeah.
I don't think he's really said which is preferable or if either are preferable yet. I think he's just kind of laying out what they are.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I guess that he was saying the corrective is roughly. I don't even think he's laid out what the preventative one. I think he just said what is talking about the corrective at this moment in time. I believe. Unless I misread it. So I believe he's just talking about the corrective, and the corrective is reducing the amount of public property there is. So it's all private property. So it's like cool. It kind of almost becomes irrelevant what your immigration policy is at that point, because it's now we're getting closer to a private property system.
Right. Although I don't think it's in the government's interest to actually do that. It's more in their interest to just not provide the protection, which is what we're seeing happen. So
yeah, they'll just shrink themselves just for shits and gigs.
Yeah.
All right. The more completely the corrective measure is carried out, in parentheses, the higher the degree of private ownership, the smaller will be the need for protective measures such as border defense. The cost of protection against foreign invaders along the United States-Mexico border, for instance, is comparatively high because for long stretches, no private property exists on the U.S. side. However, even if the cost of border protection were lowered by means of privatization, it would not disappear as long as there are substantial income and wage differentials between high and low wage territories. Hence, in order to fulfill its basic protective function, a high wage area government must also engage in preventative measures. At all ports of entry and along its borders, the government, as trustee of its citizens, must check all newly arriving persons for an entrance ticket. That is a valid invitation by a domestic property owner, and anyone not in possession of such a ticket must be expelled at its own expense.
Yeah, so I think he's saying a couple of things there. I think he's saying that the more private, like the higher percentage of private land that you have within your country, you're going to have to do less to protect the borders. However, you're still going to need to do that, I think, because like the people within that like area, I guess they're going to be more free. So you're still going to have like more people like wanting to be there and whatever. And is that what he's saying? I'm not 100%
sure. I think he's saying the high wage areas because of the idea that that's what he's talking about specifically in those types of areas. But I don't know. I mean, roughly.
I talked about that last time too, because I was saying, well, high wage areas would tend to like attract more people, but then you were saying, but then like those areas would only like want like the more skilled workers who should be earning those wages to come in, which I think is also true.
Yeah, I think he's saying what they're saying is like in the high wage areas. I mean, if anything, this is a point we're making earlier with like the whole Walmart example, but it's like a little bit of the inverse. The point being is saying like the high wage areas would be the more exclusive areas I was kind of talking to about, like to juxtapose against like the Walmart areas. So these type areas would be the areas where it would be. So these would probably be like your nice, like your upscale commercial or maybe business areas. Stuff where it's like there's no reason for you to be here because unless you're a worker or someone like you're seeing like the nice business parks and stuff that lets like no one unless you're part of that business has any reason to be there, stuff like that. That's kind of what I'm imagining. Those type of areas, and he's saying in those type of areas that would be where it would be. You would need some sort of invitation, and this actually makes sense because this starts to comport to what a private society would look like. And there would be these nice high wage areas or more exclusive areas where it would be like, hey, you need to be invited here. Like you don't just get to be here. I guess it's almost like the Elysium, like that movie or whatever. Like what is that? That one with the rich people, the sky.
Which one? Oh, Elysium.
I think it was Elysium. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Yeah, I might be confusing that with something else, but I mean, I think that might be it there. But I think he's basically just saying that, the more private territory that you have, the more that private, landowners and whatever are going to be like providing the defense for like their own property and whatever. So the government isn't going to have to be like providing as much protection, I guess, at the borders or whatever, but they will still need to because there are going to be people trying to like come into that like higher wage area, I think is what he was saying there.
Yep. All right. Okay. I'm still reading. Valid invitations are contracts between one or more private, domestic recipients, residential or commercial, and the arriving person.
Right.
I did want to make a point real quick because I don't think Hoppe did lay it out. But the kind of point is where I was getting where this comports more to a private society. Like I think like the idea of having this individuals or to come into these high wage areas, you need an invitation of some sort. I think this does kind of come close to the idea of like because people would be like, oh, well, the whole, what am I trying to say? It's the idea that whatever, fuck it. We'll just move on. I
don't know. I don't know what you're saying.
I was trying to think of how to explain it, but I was like, you know what? I'm kind of trying to jam that in, but I think you'll probably cover it anyways later. Valid invitations are contracts between one or more private, domestic recipients, residential or commercial, and the arriving person. Qua contractual admission, the arriving party can only dispose of his own private property. Hence, similar to the scenario of conditional free immigration, the admission implies that the immigrant will be excluded from all publicly funded welfare. On the other hand, it implies that the receiving party must assume legal responsibility for the actions of his invitee and the duration of his stay. The inviter is held liable to the full extent of his property for any crimes by the invitee committed against the person or property of any third party. This obligation, which implies that inviters will have to carry liability insurance for all of their guests, ends once the invitee has left the country or once another domestic property owner has assumed liability for the person in question by admitting him onto his property.
Yeah, so he's making that point again, where if you have the system where you have somebody like contractually agreeing, yes, I'm going to have this person come in with me, that makes it like a voluntary agreement between those two parties. And part of that agreement, he's saying what it should be is that this person that comes in is not going to be receiving any of the welfare, since, like, they haven't been paying into it yet. And that person that's taking them in, because they're basically vouching for that person, they are then agreeing to be held sort of responsible or liable for crimes that person might commit, which, it's kind of like that taking personal responsibility thing. And that kind of makes the incentives line up properly. So then it's like that person is really going to be incentivized to only vouch for some like immigrant that they know is a trustworthy person to come in. And then, it's also going to incentivize that immigrant to not be committing any crimes, essentially. Right. So I think that's kind of the idea there. And you skipped the part that was in that paragraph there.
Which was in parentheses. It was kind of like whatever. That was about like kids.
Which I like, though, because a bunch of the open borders homos try to compare it to people having children. And I have said that is a stupid argument to make, and that it is the people having children is much more similar to the Hoppian sponsorship program, and that's what he just said. Right?
Yeah, that's true. I'll say it real quick. Its parents are held accountable for crimes committed by their offspring as long as these are members of the parental household. That was in parentheses, and they were using that to compare it to the system, to the idea that this is kind of like you said, it's a kind of almost a perfect parallel.
Right. So parents, when they're having a child, they know they're going to be responsible for that kid. At least very much ideally, that would be the case. I mean, that's just kind of, I don't know. It's a known thing. Everybody knows that that's the case. And what else was I going to say? They're going to be held responsible. They will be responsible for their kid. And I forget where else I was going with that. Damn it.
All right, let's keep moving. The invitation may be private or commercial, temporary or permanent, concerning only housing or housing and employment, but there cannot be a valid contract involving only employment and no housing. In any case, however, as a contractual relationship, every invitation may be revoked or terminated by the host. And upon termination, the invitee, whether tourist, visiting businessman, or resident alien, will be required to leave the country. Unless another resident citizen enters into invitation contract with him.
I know what I was going to say is that the parents are inviting that baby to come in. Like that is an invitation. Like we are doing that. And not only are we assuming responsibility, but we are basically they are vouching for that person, sort of in effect by vouching for themselves as well, by saying we are going to raise this person well.
Yep.
I think is kind of the idea there. And then in the paragraph you just read, what he's saying is that because this is a contract, that's going to set up a situation where if that like immigrant or whatever like violates it, like if they commit a crime or something like that, or maybe it seems like they're about to or whatever, the host can actually like end the contract. right, like, or, with valid reason, I think they can end the contract, and then that would mean that person actually has to leave the country. So that's effectively how it would work. Yeah.
And I wanted to, the point I was trying to sort of make earlier is I was saying, like, people may wonder, like, how does this system comport more to a private system? And because the idea that you're bringing someone to an area that's, I guess, in theory, public, there's a group of people and you're just being like, oh, you can, and they did address some of those minor issues. But what I was saying is it comports to, because we're talking about a specific area, and I was getting at in a private society, and this is something he'll get into later in further chapters, he has this concept of things like covenant communities. And so I think, in a sense, these some of these areas, like including like the high wage areas we're kind of talking about here, would essentially have something similar to that, where it'd be like, hey, if you do business or operate within this area due to some conglomeration of private property owners, we have these loose rules, and these are, if you want to bring someone into this area, this is something you have to. It's kind of similar to like an HOA thing. It's like, yeah, you own your home, but when you bought this place, it had a previous owner, and as such, they had made agreement with other owners that any following owner has to sign this contract saying they'll abide by said given rules or whatever. Right. And so it'd be the same idea here, because people be like, well, this just sounds like some arbitrary government bullshit, and it is, but it comports closer to what a private property system would likely be like, because they probably would have rules concerning this. If it's an area, it's going to be more exclusive. They would have systems in place to be like, hey, this is what you need to do in order to get here. It's not always, because people hear private property and they always think one person, one set of rules. It's like, no, it's where we get retard brain with individualism and collectivism. And that's kind of where like covenant communities kind of bridges that gap. The idea of like, okay, yeah, you are operating as individuals and you do own your property, but it's like, okay, there's going to be certain areas that if you want to live in this area, you're going to have to agree to certain rules.
Right. I mean, like a family lives in a house. You have like gated communities and things like that. And
I mean, but if you want to live on the sticks,
communities,
and I'm all for living on the sticks and not having those rules, not having HOAs, or having more minuscule HOAs. But it does make sense that there would be certain areas where, like, hey, if you want to be here, like, come on, there's certain rules you got to abide by.
Right. And he is also saying here that, like, if that one host wants to end that contract, somebody else within the country could form their own contract with that person, that immigrant, and keep them in the country if they wanted to. And of course, that kind of just makes me think of when Ron DeSantis like shipped all the immigrants up to Martha's Vineyard, and the rich like Democrat progressives that are up there just like, no, we don't want them here. Like they don't.
Ron canceled his contract.
Right. They don't practice what they preach, and they were not even willing to host them, and they want to force you to do it. So even though they wouldn't be willing to do it.
All right, I'll finish out this section just because there's only one paragraph left, and I'll let you take off that the conclusion segment.
Okay.
All right. The invitee, who is at all times subject to the potential risk of immediate expulsion, may lose his legal status as a non-resident or resident alien only upon acquiring citizenship. In accordance with the objective of making all immigration invited contractual, the fundamental requirement for citizenship is the acquisition of property ownership, or more precisely, the ownership of real estate and residential property. In contrast, it would be inconsistent with the very idea of invited migration to award citizenship according to the territorial principle, as in the U.S., whereby a child born to a non-resident or resident alien in a host country automatically acquires U.S. citizenship. In fact, as most other high-wage areas governments recognize, such a child should acquire the citizenship of his parents. Granting this child citizenship involves the non-fulfillment of a host country government's basic protective function and actually amounts to an invasive act perpetrated by the government against its own citizenry.
Oh, boy.
Becoming a citizen means acquiring the right to stay in a country permanently, and a permanent invitation cannot be secured by any means other than purchasing residential property from a citizen resident. Only by selling real estate to a foreigner does a citizen indicate that he agrees to a guest permanent stay. And only if the immigrant has purchased and paid for real estate and residential housing in the host country will he assume a permanent interest in his new country's well-being and prosperity. Moreover, finding a citizen who is willing to sell residential property and who is prepared and able to pay for it, although a necessary requirement for the acquisition of citizenship, may not also be sufficient. if and insofar as the domestic property in question is subject to restrictive covenants, we were just talking about that,
Yeah, we're
the
getting
hurdles
to
to be
that soon,
taken
man.
by a prospective citizen may be significantly higher. In Switzerland, for instance, citizenship may require that the sale of residential property to foreigners be ratified by a majority of or even all the directly affected local property owners. I like that. It's a cool idea, because the idea being that, like, if we're dealing with a covenant citizen situation, I don't remember if he's saying specifically if this is an actual anarchy here, or if this is like the closest approximation. Either way, the idea being that, like, oh, I totally had a brain fart. Oh, the idea that it is, once again, the discrimination factor, just because, when it comes to private property, if someone wants to buy, if you want to buy an item from someone else, because he's saying in this paragraph here that the key in this system to acquire citizenship is to acquire property, like physical property, like specifically, and you can just like buy a watch from Walmart, but like residential property, a house. And the way property works is someone has to be willing to sell to you, and they may have their own specific reasons. They could literally be like, you're a Jew, I don't want to sell to you, or whatever, and that's okay. That's or like he was getting out with a covenant community thing. It could be a situation in his community, they've come contractually to a system of, we have certain rules, and they could be like, for whatever reason, whatever arbitrary reason, or even a decent reason, could be like, we don't want these people or that specific type of people or whatever, or have specific rules that, like, you can't just I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe they don't want people just coming over to the United States and just willy-nilly buying property just to get out of there. It could be like, hey, you need to be in the States for a couple of years, or whatever the specific rules are. It could be whatever. It's private property. You can do whatever the hell you want with it. But he's making the point that you got to buy property to get in there. You can't just like exist here and be like, well, I guess I'm a citizen.
Yeah. You mean an immigrant can't just buy like a pencil and gain citizenship if they do that?
Like Dobby with the fucking with the sock. I am a free elf.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, like it makes sense. It has to be like something substantial where like the seller is really like kind of like making a claim there, like saying like I do like trust this person like to the degree, or I'm going to make this like very substantial like sale to them, sell them a house or property, like some sort of significant amount of property, whatever. Whatever it might be.
And this comports to a private society too, as well, because in that situation, you don't have the whole idea of citizenship. But if you want to move to an area, if you want to live in an area, you need to live in an area. Like, you need to acquire property. Like, so it's the same. It really is kind of. It really does comport darn near perfectly.
It's kind of in line with his the requirements that he wants to enforce to vote as well, which he wants to restrict it to landowners, or at least says that would be a vast improvement over completely open voting. It's kind of similar to that. That it made me think of that.
All right, let's knock this bitch out. We got 2 more paragraphs.
Yes, and then was there anything else I was going to say there? Probably not. I don't remember. I forget what else I was going to say. Oh, he did mention. He kind of just uses aggressive language there. Where he's talking about the citizenship of like the parents and stuff if they're going to have kids. Where he would say that like if the parents like have not even acquired that status and now they're having kids, and then you could have like generations and generations of that happening, that he is referring to that as an invasion, because you do have like more and more, you have an increasing population of people who have not been invited.
Yes.
All right. Section 7, final section of this chapter. Judged by the immigration policy entailed by the objective of protecting one's own citizens from foreign invasion and forced integration, and of rendering all international population movements invited and contractual migrations, the Swiss government does a significantly better job than the United States. Excuse me. It is relatively more difficult to enter Switzerland as an uninvited person, and it is more difficult to stay on as an uninvited alien. In particular, it is far more difficult for a foreigner to acquire citizenship, and the legal distinction between resident citizens and resident aliens is more clearly preserved. These differences notwithstanding, the governments of both Switzerland and the U.S. are pursuing immigration policies that must be deemed far too permissive.
I think right here he is kind of slowly making his caveat, or not caveat, is a segue from one chapter to the next, since I think the next one is where he's going to start getting into some of that like covenant stuff that we were talking about earlier. So I think that's why he's kind of making the point of like Switzerland, where they do have more, I guess in some senses, the Swiss government, because their whole canton system kind of falls slightly more in line with I guess somewhat what Hoppe envisions in some ways and not in others.
But I don't know exactly how theirs work, but I'm kind of surprised he didn't mention Liechtenstein, because that's kind of his thing, and I'm fairly certain that Liechtenstein has like very strict like requirements to actually like become a citizen there and like take up permanent residency there, to the point where I think there are a lot of people who kind of live in like the neighboring countries and like commute into Liechtenstein to work there, but then still live in like whatever, like Austria, Switzerland, Germany, like whatever countries are closest there.
I think Switzerland just makes a better example for him because of the canton system. It's kind of sort of decentralized.
It's decentralized.
It's a homogenous.
It's really small though.
Yeah, it's homogenous. Liechtenstein is really small, but I think
Liechtenstein is also homogenous. But
yeah. I mean, I think Liechtenstein makes a good example for his like what must be done type stuff. But I think Switzerland probably makes a better example for somewhat kind of his immigration stuff. I'm not saying Switzerland's a perfect country by any means, and they definitely have a lot of issues. But specifically in this one issue, I think it makes a good example for Hoppe, considering some of his ideas.
But he does kind of make the point because he does talk a lot in this book about how like a monarchy makes it much more clear the distinction between the ruling class and the ruled class. He's saying here that if you have this more what is it, kind of a more invitation oriented immigration system, that makes it more clear who the citizens versus the non-citizens are, I guess. That it just made me kind of think of kind of the parallels between those things.
All
right. Moreover, the excessive permissiveness of their immigration policies and the resulting exposure of the Swiss and American population to forced integration by foreigners is further aggravated by the fact that the extent of public property in both countries and other high-wage areas is substantial. That tax-funded welfare provisions are high and growing, and foreigners are not excluded, and that contrary to official pronouncements, even the adherence to free trade policies is anything but perfect. Accordingly, in Switzerland, the U.S., and most other high-wage areas, popular protests against immigration policies have grown increasingly louder. It has been the purpose of this chapter not only to make the case for the privatization of public property, domestic laissez-faire, and international free trade, but in particular for the adoption of a restrictive immigration policy. By demonstrating that free trade is inconsistent with both unconditionally or conditionally free immigration, and requires instead that migration be subject to the condition of being invited and contractual, it is our hope to contribute to more enlightened future policies in this area.
Yep. See, so use Switzerland for both purposes. For a good example to hold some of his immigration ideas, and as an example to show the bad side of some of his immigration ideas that he's making, because he's making the point that Swiss and American, with all the welfare stuff,
right?
But he's saying the Swiss does a slightly better job because they're more. It's more of an invitation. It's more difficult to enter it as an uninvited person, and But anyways, this is kind of why I think Switzerland makes a good example, because for the pros and cons in some sense.
Yeah, and he's kind of just summing it up there and just saying that, well, there are restrictions on trade like within these countries anyway, within the US anyway. But yeah, the US also has like all this public property, so it makes sense to restrict immigration. And he does make the case where, I kind of mentioned this at the beginning where we were going back to what we talked about last week. He's not only saying that that free trade and free immigration are not the same thing and kind of have nothing to do with each other. He's actually going further than that and saying that in order to have free trade, you actually need to restrict immigration in some capacity if you do have a government there, if you want to like approximate free trade more so, because that open immigration is forced integration, whatever he says, and that is like an anti-free trade policy. It's a violation of private property agreements.
Yep. Well, all right, man, let's get out of here. I'm looking forward to the next one. I was skimming forward, looking to the future chapters. The next chapter we'll do is on cooperation, tribe, city, and state. So that'll definitely be a fun one. After that, on conservatism and libertarianism, that'll be a fun one. And the following one after that is on the errors of classical liberalism and the future of liberty. We're going to get a lot of good ammo.
Yeah,
for
is that
making
that's
fun of
the
those
last
people.
one?
No, it's not the last one. There's more
Oh.
after that, but
Oh,
those are
shit,
the
I
next
forget.
few.
right.
There's 1, 2. There's 2 more after that. So
one of these that's upcoming is the one that like everybody takes issue with, or everybody points out that one excerpt and like doesn't even contextualize it. So
yeah, I mean, when he
We'll
said
have fun
kill
with that.
all the gays, no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
What he
Yeah.
meant was, just kidding. Obviously, we'll get to that and we'll have that discussion when it comes across. Toad, you want to go and drop your plugs? We'll get the hell out of here, man.
Yeah, Tower Gang Toad on Twitter, the Tower Gang podcast, which both of us are hosts of. It's hilarious, extremely offensive comedy. We did another episode last night. Every Wednesday night, 9:11 p.m. Eastern, we are live on Rumble, which is kind of our platform that we're pushing at this point. Even though we do still do it on Odyssey. I said Dill. I like Dill, by the way. And we're on YouTube as well. Somehow still, we at least live stream there and leave a couple episodes up. We have the locals, towergang.locals.com, where you can support us monetarily. And yeah, Tower Gang Pod, pretty much everywhere else, towergangpod.com for all the links.
All right. And yeah, this is the No Way Jose show. Find me on YouTube, all the major art packages, Odyssey as well. If you want to follow me on Twitter at Tower Gang Jose. I'm also on Facebook as Jose Galison. I don't really do anything on there, but whatever, if that's what you want to do. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And with that, we are out.
Peace. Heil.